1498 was an epoch-making year in the history of the world. In May that year, Vasco da Gama, Portuguese nobleman and explorer, landed in India, some miles north of Calicut on the Malabar coast. This landing marked the successful conclusion of a quest he had begun nearly a year earlier, to find a sea route from Europe to the east around Africa. Da Gama's voyage was to become a turning point in human history, opening as it did the doors to the colonial era in Asia and Africa. The story of the rise and fall of Portugal's Eastern Empire, the Estado da India, is a fascinating saga that has to date remained largely untold. In the video that follows, we have tried to piece together some glimpses of a key fragment of this story. Portuguese India.
The initiative to try to find a sea route to India begins shortly after 1415, when it became an idea to try to get round Africa and attack the Muslims who were controlling much of the trade coming out of the Far East from the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese had the advantage in Europe of being a relatively politically settled kingdom, and this gives Prince Henry the Navigator the political base that he needs to mount a series of expeditions that go down the coast of Africa between 1420 more or less and 1488 with the voyage of Bartholomew Dias, which finally rounds the Cape of Good Hope and opens the way for Vasco da Gama's voyage in 1498 to find a sea route that ends up on the Malabar coast of India.
King Emmanuel was still thinking of the conquest of Jerusalem, and so the idea was an alliance with the Christians of India and Ethiopia also against Egypt to conquer Jerusalem. It was very easy to present their expansion as a service to Christendom and so on.
The economic motivation, of course, is that the Far East was tremendously wealthy. There was a great desire for a whole range of commodities that the Europeans wanted to have, specifically spices. And the only way to make meat palatable after months of being preserved is to put pepper and other spices into it. And this is only available in the Far East. And of course, it's the Muslims who are controlling the pepper trade. So the Portuguese have a multifaceted reason for wanting to get round Africa.
In 1498, Vasco da Gama landed at Pandala in Kollam, about 16 kilometers north of Calicut. From there he came to Calicut region, and on the way he visited Durga temple and he worshipped there, thinking that this temple is dedicated to Virgin Mary. Then he was received in the Samaritan's court.
Though initially welcoming, the Zamorin turned hostile when local Moorish merchants poisoned his ears against Vasco, sensing a threat to their monopoly of the Malabar trade. Vasco had to set sail for Portugal with little more than a token load of spices. His successor, Cabral, managed to set up a trading outpost 2 years later in Calicut, but after a bloody battle with local enemies, he had to retreat to Cochin. Here, he was finally able to set up the first Portuguese settlement in India, encouraged by the friendly local Raja. But it was Afonso de Albuquerque who really laid the foundation stone of Portugal's Eastern Empire when he conquered Goa in 1510.
Albuquerque clearly understood that he needed to have something in Hormuz, something in Goa, and something in Malacca in order to control the maritime Asian economic system. He also understood that the Portuguese could have a maritime empire, but not a continental one.
Albuquerque made Goa the capital of the empire that he dreamed of creating in the east.
Afonso de Albuquerque tried to stabilize Portuguese colonialism by asking his soldiers to marry Muslim widows, starting the mint in Goa, then establishing the first municipality in Asia. So he was going in a very systematic way to remain here.
Caravels and naus were the two kinds of ships used at the time of the Portuguese expansion. Caravels were faster moving single-deck craft that could carry a maximum of 100 men. Naus were slower ships with multiple decks that could carry several hundred passengers as well as cargo.
The ships were probably 40 meters in length and had aboard ladies, men, nobles, slaves, and all of them lived during a period of 6 to 9 months, and sometimes they don't stop in any hour from Lisbon to Goa.
Voyages were beset by hazards, like running out of fresh water, falling ill, and being stranded mid-ocean when winds were unfavorable. As many as half didn't survive the journey, and the rest didn't have it too easy either.
Here on the deck they ate, they worked, they slept. They did not have any water closets to satisfy their physical needs. So they had that bucket. When the man finishes his work, he ties this around his fist, throws the bucket to the water. The water goes around inside and cleans it. As you know, in the 15th century there was no toilet paper. So they had the brush. That's with what they cleaned themselves.
No women were allowed. So we had women being smuggled on board ship in collusion with some of the crew, but they had to be careful not to reveal themselves till after they had passed the Canary Islands. Then they would reveal themselves, and then you're not going to kill them.
Starting with Cochin, the Portuguese gradually set up several forts and trading settlements along the Malabar coast. North of Goa too, they seized and fortified several strategic ports that brought the lucrative Indian Ocean trade under their exclusive control.
In 1515, the Portuguese were looking for a place to establish themselves here in Diu, but they were not given a chance by the Sultanate. At that time, Bahadur Shah took help from the Portuguese to fight against the Mughals, who were after the Sultanate. And Bahadur Shah entered into a treaty with the Portuguese, and the Portuguese were allowed to build a fort. When the war was over and Bahadur wanted it back, the Portuguese wouldn't allow them. So Bahadur Shah started war with the Portuguese. There was first siege, second siege of the fort. He couldn't succeed. And with this defeat, Bahadur Shah then never came back again for the fort. And as such, then the Portuguese remained for good here in Diu.
In 1533, the Portuguese captured Vasai, but actual treaty took place in 1534, and Vasai was officially handed over to the Portuguese by Bahadur Shah of Gujarat. Portuguese used this fort as the headquarters of province of the north, right from Tarapur, Asheri to Chaur.
The city of Daman had once about 8,000 souls. It had about 7 monasteries, and it was the hub of Christian activities in the north.
Barely 100 years after da Gama's first voyage, the Portuguese had already established a virtual monopoly over maritime trade in the East. What made it possible for this minor European nation to transform itself so rapidly into a global power?
It's certainly a paradox that one of the most poor countries in Europe was the one to be chosen to lead the European expansion. It's a small country, it's a poor country, and it was a way of expanding the frontiers and getting a maritime appendix.
What allows them to dominate with a relative handful of ships and a relative handful of men is that they had stronger weapons of war. By mounting heavy cannons on heavily built ships, the Europeans were able to arrive on the scene with something that was unassailable.
To actually prosecute an expansion where the only link which you have to the other side is the sea, and where there are lots of powers in between, and you're still conceiving of an empire which is not a contiguous space, and still you are able to leap over those gaps. This is something which appears to be a strategic conception the Spanish and the Portuguese sort of managed to refine in the late 15th century.
Rarely did a ship sailing eastwards leave Lisbon without a group of clergymen aboard. Their main function, though, in the early decades, was to cater to the spiritual needs of the Portuguese.
The first real conversion is in 1535. So you have a period of 40 years that you have priests aboard the ships, in the fortresses, but you don't have plans to convert masses of people.
It was only in the 1540s that the focus of the clergy shifted to evangelization among the local population. As the systematic conversion campaign gathered momentum, various missionary orders flocked to Goa. The Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Augustinians, and many others. But above all, the Jesuits, led by Francis Xavier.
The missionaries thought it would be very easy to convert people here, but then they realized that it was difficult. And this really frustrated them. And they used to write to Europe about their frustration. The missionaries had to give the impression that they were making many conversions, when perhaps in reality they were not making. Anything that would scandalize people, that had to be censored, because these letters would be read in the pulpits, in the churches. Merely by telling that they were making many conversions, they would be praised, they would get funds, and without funds they would not be able to do any sort of work. They would cut the hair tuft, or they would force them to drink wine, or they would force them to eat food cooked by Christians, which would mean loss of caste.
If a missionary would throw boiled rice in their well, suppose if a meat piece is thrown in the house, the entire family was converted to Christianity.
The missionaries soon realized that individual converts were feeling isolated and being pressured to revert by their communities. So they switched to a more effective alternative, winning over village heads, who then facilitated mass conversions.
Once it was decided by the village commune that they would convert to Christianity, there were mass baptisms. So they say 1,000 souls were baptized on this day. And then they were given a big dress, some gifts and all that. And they were paraded in the streets of Old Goa to show that, see, pomp and ceremony, these are the Christians. And it is said that there were a lot of malpractices also, that some of the people who had already converted to Christianity, they came again. They said, I want to become a Christian. What is your name? Antusilai. Antusilai, you are a Brahmin, come on. So he got a new dress again.
A whole new identity was created for these converts, from what they wore to the adoption of Portuguese names.
The Portuguese names were given of sponsors. Sometimes it was the viceroy, sometimes it was the captain of the fort, sometimes it was people who gave a certain amount of money for this whole movement and said, give my names to them, which distinguished them from the Hindus.
The shift to the new religion was sometimes accompanied by the building of churches by the community where temples once stood.
The Gaonkars of the village commune owned the temple. So the temple was pulled down, a church was built. The rulers didn't do it. The Gaonkars themselves. So I have got a ownership of the property. I can change the nature of the property.
Even if the persons were converted, they had the affinity to the place. So they didn't feel the difference. Instead of the temple, this a big church has come up. So they started worshipping there.
The Brahmins of Margaon invited the Archbishop. They said, you want to build a church, we'll find a place for you. And they took him around and showed various sites. And the Archbishop apparently borrowed the sword from one of the Fidalgos and stabbed the ground and said, it will be here. And that was the temple of Damodara.
As far as Kerala is concerned, Francis Xavier visited several times the southern coastal area, and his method was very peaceful. He was preaching to the people and teaching them the message of the gospel. So it was the Portuguese who actually introduced Christian prayers, biblical texts, and popularized Christianity in Kerala.
In Kerala, and as in the rest of India, we had a caste system where the lower castes were not respected. Whereas when the Portuguese converted people to their religion, they broke over all the walls of the caste system. And that is why all these people in the coastal areas, they all converted to Catholic religion.
The social upheaval triggered by conversions also led to families being divided along religious lines, especially in Goa.
Families were broken. They had to migrate from this place. It was migration of the deities and the temples also. They took away the deities, established there wherever they went.
There is a song which symbolizes the division that took place in Goan society at the time of conversion, because saving Hinduism meant crossing the river. And the theme of this entire song is, I'm going to cross the river. How Saiba Poltadi Veta. How Saiba Poltadi Veta, Damula Logna Gueta, Mak Saiba Vati Dakoi, Mak Saiba Vati Korona.
For those who stayed behind, a long and painful new chapter was about to begin. The Goa Inquisition. This dreaded institution of the Catholic Church was created in Europe. It was meant to punish newly converted Jews who were secretly continuing with their traditional customs and practices. Brought to Goa in 1560, it became an instrument of terror that targeted thousands accused of similar violations over the course of the next 250 years.
In Portugal, I found a big list of people who are condemned before the Inquisition for no fault of theirs, but somebody complained that man is indulging in some gentilities and all that. Illiterate people, you know, people from the rural area. There are Christians, there are Hindus, there are Muslims in that list. And they were punished, you know. If you were a Christian and you practiced the gentilities, as they called them, you know, you were burnt at the stake. Well, if you were a Hindu, you were whipped or deported. Now, who would venture to become a Christian and get burned at the stake, you tell me? What is preferable? Better get the whips and go out. Or get exiled, you know, or your lands are confiscated, but your life is saved, you know. But if you become a Christian, your life is at stake. There were some secret chambers where they used to torture by water. Water is to drip on you. Torture by fire, to extricate confessions from the people.
There was one Krishna Shet, you know. He was very rich and he had a daughter called Tulasi. She was just 16 years old. But she was quite favorite of Francis Xavier. As a child, whenever he used to call her, she used to join. But she was a prodigy child, had a tremendous knowledge about Vedic religion, Indian philosophy. She was forcibly converted. Her father was also converted, but she continued with her old traditions. She was taken to the stakes along with others, 9 or 10 people were there, and she was burnt alive. So she was the first victim of Goa Inquisition.
Compared to the number of people who were tried, the number of people who were actually burnt at stake is very small. A lot of the people actually were given some exemplary punishment, few years of prison. But you know, the image that you have, you fall into the hands of the Inquisition, you'll wind up at the stake. End of story. That's obviously untrue.
They tried to convert us culturally. Edicts were issued by the Inquisition that you should not sing OVs during weddings. OVs are a part of the wedding system. You should not carry vedo. Still we are doing it, you know, in spite of the Inquisition. You read the orders of the Inquisition. They were all like this, silly, when you look at them from today's life.
The Inquisition was very violent, very tyrannical, and he said that the Goa Inquisition was perhaps the worst in the world at that time.
Some consider its spiritual mission the most significant aspect of Portugal's venture in the East. But in fact, more material dimensions were its real sustenance. Pepper and other spices from the East dominated early Lisbon-bound cargoes. All that Portugal could offer in exchange was wine and cork, neither of which was very attractive to Oriental buyers. Far more sought after by the East were metals, which compelled Portugal to join hands with German and Italian mercantile groups who could finance such trade.
Even for the first trip, they had to depend on one Italian financier, Bartolomeo Marchioni. And in the same strain, we find the Fuggers becoming very important. Fuggers during this time had a monopoly over the copper mines in various parts of Europe, and the copper which was produced under their direction was very much used in India. Even in the contract between the King of Cochin and the King of Portugal, we find that part payment should be made in copper. From 1505 onwards, they had entered on a kind of a contract of supplying materials and men and even ships.
Most of the upland pepper trade is in the hands of Syrian Christians and Muslims. And these people bring the pepper from upland and they take it into the port of Cochin, and there's the Portuguese representative who's there with his scribe and his assistants, and they're supposed to take this pepper, they're supposed to wait and they're supposed to accept it. Now they always claim that if they find some degree of adulteration or dirt or whatever it is in it, that they will discount it. And then there are typically major disputes that break out periodically. This is one of the reasons why actually Portuguese constantly also try and shift their points of procurement, because they're often dissatisfied with what they get. The big Indian Ocean currency at the time of the arrival of the Portuguese is a thing called the lari. And then in the course of the 16th century, the Spanish coin, the real de ocho, becomes the major international traded currency. Then you get these others. For instance, the sherafin is actually a transformation of the word ashrafi, which is the ashrafi dinar coming out of the Middle East. Similarly, the Portuguese use a term pardao, which comes from a South Indian term pratapa. So they often take these local coins, modify them, and create a variant of their own, which they then produce from their mints. In the early 16th century, it seems that the most commonly used trading language in the Indian Ocean was some form of Arabic. If you look at the letters which the rulers of Kerala were writing to the Portuguese, they were often writing to them in Arabic, and we actually have some of these letters.
The first thing the Portuguese did in the time of Albuquerque and after that was to know what were the most profitable regional networks of commerce, and they began to have a place in the most important. For example, one of those that was to bring horses, Arabian horses and Persian horses, from Hormuz to Goa. This existed before the Portuguese. What the Portuguese did was to combine the two ports and to have a new market. And there are economic historians that say that the trade in horses in this route was more profitable than trade in spices to Europe.
Old Goa was in the process of being expanded, of becoming a major trading center, in fact the biggest city in Asia at that time, with the first printing press, the first medical college and so on.
The trade entrepot for goods coming from the Far East became Lisbon by the middle of the 16th century. Anything coming from China, from India, ivory coming from Africa, spices coming from the Spice Islands, most of it was transshipped through Lisbon. A lot of people have the misconception that because the Portuguese were able to carry goods by sea from the Far East in great quantities and cut out the overland aspect of the voyage of these commodities, the price in Europe must have dropped. Well, that wasn't true. The Portuguese fixed the price very high so that the price more or less remained the same, but the transport cost of those goods was much, much cheaper because it was almost all done by ocean, which meant that more profits accrued to the Portuguese. And so Lisbon becomes fabulously wealthy with riches from the Far East.
This prosperity created a new elite in Portuguese India who could afford all the luxuries the world of that time had to offer, including black African slaves. Though a fraction of the millions that were brought to the Americas, these slaves who were brought eastward still numbered in thousands.
There was a regular market of slaves in Old Goa in front of the present-day museum. There they used to inspect the slaves, buy them and take them away. Especially the slaves from Guinea were sought after because those ladies were quite sturdy. So one contingent used to come this side, another contingent used to go towards Brazil.
The Santa Monica convent had very many slaves. All the kind of help that they needed was all done by slaves. So surely there would have been a large slave population also there.
I was stunned to find out that, my own family had a slave. His name was Valent. They had him up until my father remembers him. So that is, quite recent history.
There is a feeling that one religion and one group of people prospered and the others were more or less effaced, which is not at all the truth. And members of the other community would be the first people to acknowledge that. The great thing about the Hindu community is that they kept their traditions, they kept their faith, they also benefited from exposure, from culture, from everything else. Whereas the Catholic entered administration, education, they were primary school teachers, clerks in the office, but the Hindu was inside trade, really in charge of the economy.
I'm coming from a historic family. Kad sociologist Kamuti Mamai is a joint family. Historically, we are very famous. We had very vast connection with various countries, say Portugal, Mozambique, Brazil, China, Timor. There are even documents to prove that 2 military officers which were captured by the Portuguese in the beginning of the 19th century were released by us. Such was the influence of the family with the Portuguese.
Just as the Hindu traders created their own sphere of influence under the Portuguese dominion, so also did private Portuguese enterprise. From the very early days, Portuguese merchants who settled in the eastern colonies developed their own parallel trading empire.
Portuguese settlers that settled in India and married local women became a kind of bourgeoisie in the Portuguese ports as Goa and especially in Cochin. In Cochin they were very powerful because the local king preferred to protect private merchants than the Portuguese crown. Mylapore became a center of commercial activities of the Portuguese private merchants in the Bay of Bengal. And twice at least the viceroys of Goa thought of sending a military expedition against Mylapore because they represented different interests. In one case the interests of the crown and the concessionaires of the crown, and the other the informal and free trade of private traders.
For a period bordering 100 years, a century or so, the Portuguese were able to have a virtual monopoly on goods coming from the Far East until first the Dutch and then the British and the French cut in on that monopoly in the 17th and 18th centuries.
In the 17th century, the long-distance trade conducted by the Portuguese is declining, but local trade not, because many Portuguese traders remain in Cochin, in Mylapore, in Bengal and so on, and they act as middlemen of the Dutchman and the Englishman.
After the retreat of the official power, the second and the third generation of Portuguese were in those places forming communities of Portuguese ascendancy, and that is the continuation of the empire, the shadow empire.
Goa was the main center of administration. The Viceroy's jurisdiction was right from Cape of Good Hope to Malacca. They had their own administrative organs, judicial organs, then they had their own military, then there were fortresses, then the factories. So they built up the entire network with which they could pull on for centuries together.
There was a period, especially from 1580s up to the beginning of 18th century, a lot of corruption. In the forts, the captains used to sell cannons and gunpowder.
There was a lot of respect for law. The laws, good or bad, were well structured. You knew when you had transgressed it.
One must remember that Goa had very few Portuguese, either in government or among the army. You see, the top posts were Goan, you see. Very few Portuguese were here comparatively.
What happens when two great peoples, two ancient civilizations intermingle over nearly 500 years? That melting pot is bound to produce something unique. And this certainly happened with the Indo-Portuguese encounter.
The Portuguese expansion in Asia and Brazil, it was the first time to connect the world. You have Indians in Lisbon, we have Portuguese marrying Indian women here, so it's the first multiracial project of the world.
The Portuguese had great respect for Goan society because Goan society was just as rich and as educated as they were, and they participated in the Portuguese government in Portugal itself.
For the last 38 years I am living in Portugal, I never felt that I was not one of them, considered an outsider. Just now we have one minister of Goan origin. We have many professors of Goan origin. Out of the 5 Supreme Court judges, 3 are Goans.
There was a class formed in Goa of mestizos, which is the word for half-breed. But that was not at the highest class level. It was the result of mass marriages of Portuguese soldiers of the lowest rank with the lower caste Goan ladies. All of them are in Portugal now.
The Portuguese failed to win over the Orthodox Syrian Christians of the Malabar coast, whom they had hoped would become local allies in their imperial enterprise. Instead, it was the newly converted Catholic communities in areas of Portuguese influence who became the social base of their empire.
There was clearly this Western outlook, and it went right down. It wasn't superficial. It went to language, it went to attitude, manners, customs, food, dress, everything was changed. So we became really westernized. It was sort of neither fish nor fowl, you know.
Soon after the Inquisition, the Goan Christians, who did not want to eat beef and this and that was the first small exodus. But the big exodus that took place was in the 18th century. The 3 main reasons that are attributed. First was the Maratha raids in North Goa in particular. sometimes, killed priests and some burned down churches. The second one is, there was a famine in North Goa. And there was an epidemic, they say, which made this exodus of people go to Mangalore. Mangalore also, since it was under the Portuguese, they had some relatives there. So that's how they linked up with those relatives. And when they went to Mangalore, they were given land. And people were mainly, farmers, And then they spread out to Chikmagalur and other places.
The East Indian community date back to the Portuguese advent over here because they are converts from the local Marathi speaking people. From Bombay right up to Revdanda and Chaul and Tarapur.
Conversion did not destroy caste. In fact, sometimes I feel it exacerbated caste because that was a kind of link with tradition for the convert. And so caste prevented intermarriage. Of course, there must have been some intermarriage, especially among the upper castes. Professionally, you went to Portugal, you studied there, you married a Portuguese girl, or you had officers coming here. But it is not the kind of mixed race that is the common perception.
With these stubby fingers and this broad backside and this flat nose and my color, I don't think there is any Portuguese blood in me. But if at all there is some great-great-grandmother of mine who accepted a Portuguese man, I only hope she enjoyed it.
A large group of them went out of Goa into the backwoods of the neighboring region. They had a little colony there by themselves and they got lost to the people outside. And much later, one scholar found this colony of Negroes. They all had Christian names and it was a watered down generation to a certain extent, but they still are there in a region called Dandeli.
The Christian community has very close links with the Portuguese people. Right from cradle to the coffin, they converse in Portuguese, and till this day even the religious service, the social activities and everything is in Portuguese language.
Konkani was banned because Konkani was a language of ritual. They just felt that Konkani would keep the convert in touch with original culture. So the whole idea was to create a kind of social engineering, whereby the Christian community was completely different. There were no schools in Konkani and the language was not developed, and although missionaries did write dictionaries and translate the Bible and write Puranas and so forth in Konkani, it was never really taught. But it never became the language of employment. The language of employment was Portuguese. But the resilience of the Konkani language is that it never died. They could not, ban it from people's tongues.
The Portuguese influence on the Konkani language, especially among the Catholics, is very prominent in very many words that we use today. All words ending with "ão", for instance, "beção", "teção", "steção", "tenteção", "maldição", seem to have their roots in the Portuguese words.
In this Damanese dialect, we develop a strain of Portuguese where there is no rule or regard for grammar. The main concern of the people was to communicate with least word that could be used. A Portuguese would say, "Onde que tu vais?" In Daman, we would say, "Un vai." It's a shortcut.
We Catholic consider to be our mother tongue Portuguese. So that's why we continue speaking Portuguese even till today. but they don't know to write or read also. We sing Portuguese also. Even in the church, we have masses in Portuguese.
तुम लोग इधर कौन सा भाषा बोलता है?
पोर्तुगीज।
पोर्तुगीज। हमारे देश का है कि बाहर का है?
हमारे
देश का है। तुम कहाँ रहते हो? तुम्हारा भाषा में कैसा बोलेगा? तुम कौन से स्कूल में पढ़ते हो? हम लोग सब मच्छी खाते हैं।
In Malayalam language, more than 300 words I have located are in Portuguese.
Everything which is pork is originally from Portugal or from the islands of Madeira, using wines in the meat. You must have heard of sarapatel, marchão, vindalho. And vindalho means vinha d'alhos, that is garlic and wine. And it used to be marinated there for several hours and then it's cooked. And it is made a regional dish with chilies and with the spices that are local.
If you go to Porto Alegre, which is in Alentejo, they have the sarapatel there. And the sarapatel is made with just the guts of the sheep. And the taste and almost like the one that you have in India.
They have these different bol de rei, bol de Portugal and all sorts of cakes with the Portuguese names which have a Portuguese influence definitely on them and resemble very much the actual sweets that are made in Portugal. Though of course ingredients like we use in India, a lot of coconut which is not used in Portugal so much.
Even after conversion of the Hindus into Catholicism, they couldn't wear what foreigners were wearing. It was impossible to wear something like a corset or a big skirt, which was completely impractical for a climate like India. And how the Goan ladies used the trade routes between India and Malaga and India and China and India and Arabia to create garments that would please the Portuguese, a new sense of aesthetic as far as what clothing was supposed to be, and at the same time keep it still Indian. So we have the banbaju, which has a long choli, almost like a Persian Arabic influence, but with Chinese embroidery, which came to us from Macau. We have a skirt which is a marriage between a South Indian lungi and a Malaysian sarong or a baju. So these influences which they took from different areas and covered their bodies, because that's what the Portuguese objected to, you know, navel showing and skin showing, and how they adapted it and created a very unique Indo-West statement. The men's clothing actually changed more drastically than the women's, because at the time when the Portuguese came here, the men were wearing loincloths or what we call kashtis. Very few of the upper classes were wearing dhotis or lungis. And when they got converted, they were not going to allow them to come to church wearing a kashti. You just had to wear a trouser and a shirt.
They had these choir masters teaching people right down to the smallest villages church music. And church music at that time was very beautiful, was the foundation of Western music as well, Gregorian chant. And as a result of this, they laid a solid Western musical base in Goa, which made Goa produce practically all the Western musicians for the rest of India for a long time. The mando has two distinct parts. The first part is usually a romantic love song, and the second part is a bouncy set of humorous verses which are far more Indian in character. But to demonstrate how the first part of the mando took its influence directly from Gregorian chant, Kyrie eleison. Now the mando. Sogle muje vido cintunu
ka nare konu dil
But the second part of the Mando, which was more regional and lively, immediately went into Indian and native rhythms. Undra muja mama anião santantuca, undra muja mama anião santantuca, anima sori chapila lagi fed mandinaka, anima sori chapila lagi fed mandinaka. Amani gumani nach papa, amani gumani nach papa. Commando Shiva Shiva, Commando Shiva re. Amani gumani nach papa, amani gumani nach papa. Commando Shiva Shiva, Commando Shiva re. Maya Maya yo, Maya Maya yo, Maya Maya yo, Maya Maya yo.
You also have a very typical costume for the Mando. The ladies usually wear a long gown from their waist downwards, and long sleeved blouse, high necked, and then they have a Japanese kind of a fan in their hand, and then they adorn their hair with the straws. There's also a very sophisticated sweatless kind of dance form going along with the Mando. Gents always wear a western costume, frilled shirts and long tailed coat, and they also dance very slowly. Even for the Dulpad, which the Mando always ends with, I believe Mando is of the aristocracy, not of the common people. Through the influence of the Portuguese, Goan rich families who are influenced by this Portuguese culture adopted this form. Portuguesatan pakale aylat ranak marunku, Portuguesatan pakale aylat ranak marunku, far zatay ranantu, or Madgavan tovia ger mezukela redondu, Madgavan tovia ger tacherek cheduna sota, Oshenkorun bendu, tika ek paklo choita burka galon tondu. So history that way is recorded in our folk songs, and we get a glimpse of the sufferings that our ancestors had to go through.
Among the Portuguese descendants of Vaipin near Cochin, a lot of Creole songs were prevalent till recently, but these days most of them have forgotten these songs. Shingli none, eu kara kase, casanota, portanota, calelo kase, você minha frente, bonito doncella, nossa lo kase, nona minha, nona Portugal. Throughout Malabar, anti-Portuguese feeling is still prevalent, because for several hundred years this was cultivated through folk songs and various other stories, especially among the Muslims. Like the story of this destruction of the Portuguese fort at Chalium is the theme of this folk song called Fatul Mubin.
Bhai Moti Tavin, Bhai Moti Tavin, Bhai Moti Tavin, Bhai Moti Tavin, para que chura vida. Anélia da hora Bhai Moti, jeta fala na cova, Deus amuno chai Bhai Moti, ele é filho da poba.
Ó vivão de Mugará, ó vivão de Mugará, para mim mandou chamar. A razão não sei porquê, minha vida querer tirar, solta para me largar.
Rio Sandal Calo da minha pátria, juro sempre lembrança a ti e com saudade do meu Portugal, pátria amante, terra triunfante, meu Rio Sandal Calo, sempre hei de amá-lo.
Goa produced an incredible amount of beautiful carved religious figures in ivory and in wood. Then it went on to produce beautiful silverware for religious ceremonies and embroidered vestments. Later on in domestic architecture, it moved on to producing beautiful woodwork for windows of different styles and a whole range of beautiful furniture.
The Indian people, they had not pieces of furniture, so the Portuguese brought with them the prototypes, and then they adapted it with decoration and technique and materials belonging to India.
The outlines sometimes were derived from Renaissance furniture, but the carvings within that furniture were very Hindu. Little Marutis or snakes and temples within a general Renaissance form. The earliest things built in Goa were commemorative chapels in Manuelino style. The large basilicas and cathedrals in all Goa were proper Renaissance. One of the greatest challenges and inspirations for the Portuguese architecturally, initially, in building their churches and basilicas in Goa could have even been the scale of the South Indian temples with their colossal gopurams.
The whole city of Old Goa, that architecture is not Portuguese. Most of the missionaries were either Spaniards or Italian. And we have Italian and Spanish architectural idiom in Old Goa. So from that time onwards, it's all amalgamated, mixed architectural styles.
What was wonderful was the participation of local craftsmen and artisans in the interior decoration of these churches. They used their own imagination to carve the column tops, and that is what created a complete Indo-Portuguese style. The Portuguese would kick off their development with a big church in the center of these villages. Then it was followed by the marketplace and a sort of civic center, and then each one of them had about 4 or 5 neighborhoods beautifully hidden in valleys, next to fields, in coconut groves and so on. And these 100 villages together produced quite a bit of architectural heritage. The churches, the large houses of the landlords, which are around maybe 160 altogether in all these places. And then later on, the middle class houses with a blend of Indian and Mediterranean influences, plus things like the balcony, the veranda, and of course the tiled roofs, the variety of windows, all the time through an interaction of the Portuguese style with the imagination of the Indian craftsmen that were participating. The first spaces that were evolved in what we today call Old Panjim, it is very similar to Portuguese towns. We have a whole section of Panjim called Fontainhas, which could be in Old Lisbon, because of the style as well as because of the way those narrow streets and things were laid out.
From a very early date, Europeans are fascinated by the kinds of medicinal plants that they find in India, and they are interested in their healing qualities and how they can be applied not only in the colonies to combat tropical diseases, but also how they can be brought back to Europe.
The table that we use, it is called a mesa. It was introduced by the Portuguese, and windows we call it janela, and it is a Portuguese word, and they introduced bungalow type houses here. And our day-to-day utensils, household items, almirah for example. We never heard of this almirah before the Portuguese. Ananas, it is called pineapple. It was introduced by the Portuguese. Like that, several garden plants were also introduced by the Portuguese. All these brought by the Jesuit missionaries from the station in São Paulo, Brazil. So that way, the influence of the Portuguese changing the economy of Kerala is very significant.
Whether it is tapioca from Brazil or breadfruit, cashew nut, they became the staple food of the natives. And in the days of famine, we survived because of tapioca. And cashew is even today a major industry employing thousands of people.
The 20th century saw the decline and fall of the colonial era in world history. But long before this, Portuguese power in the East had become a shadow of its former self. The rise of the Indian nationalist movement inspired a similar struggle in Portuguese India, which finally saw its dream come true when Indian military action forced Portugal to relinquish control in 1961. Today, more than 4 decades later, what was once the grandly styled Estado da India has moved on. The swirling tide of global multiculturalism has washed away all but a few quaint traces of Portuguese footprints from the sands of Indian shores.
Right now, the Catholic population is only about 200, roughly. I have got concern that we should maintain the culture, what we had inherited from our ancestors, and to keep up this Portuguese speaking here. So that's why we are part of the choir in the church, where we call the children also to sing. If they don't want to learn Portuguese, at least by singing the hymns to Our Lady, they could learn some Portuguese word and could keep up the Portuguese speaking, which we call it to be our mother tongue.
Whatever laws prevails now are those that were there as on 19 December 1961. The Portuguese laws continued developing and our Portuguese laws stopped there.
The oldest record which Goa Archives has is of 1498, and the book is pertaining to Misericordia. The most important series is Moções do Reino, which means that the whatever correspondence which to receive from June to September at Goa from kings and other viceroys, and it covers more than 436 volumes, and the period covered is from 1560 to 1914.
In Portugal too, all that remains of the Indo-Portuguese past are historical records, scattered artifacts, and perhaps a certain nostalgia.
In the Arquivo Histórico Ultramarino, we have a lot of documentation that shows the relation between Portugal and India and all the old colonies of Portugal. For India itself, we have about 500 boxes full of documents, about 100 documents per box for the period of 16th century up to 1833.
If you go even today to Portugal, you can actually see lots of very curious products from India which are lying around in people's houses and personal connections and museums. I mean, a lot of Indian or Asian furniture, trinkets, ivories, quilted bedspreads, stuff like that.
As a Portuguese, I'm very sensitive to find the traces of Portuguese legacy here or in Cochin or elsewhere. It's very curious to see in architecture the same systems used in Brazil put up here.
It is equally fascinating to visit places in Portugal associated with the architects of the discoveries and unearth some of the skeletons buried there.
Vasco da Gama was the Count of Vidigueira. In his will, he wrote that he wanted to be buried here because of the close relationship he had with the community and the place. He died in India, and then some years later he was brought here. In 1888, the government thought it was better that he went to Lisbon, and then they made a study of the skeleton that was found here. The coffins were open, it's very messy in the ground. Finally they took one skeleton to Lisbon, but when they got there they thought it wasn't Vasco da Gama's skeleton, and they sent it back and took another to Jerónimos. That's where the possible skeleton is now today.
Looking back on a story that spans 500 years can be an ambitious and rather daunting exercise. Many views, interpretations, and assessments are possible.
One extreme should be a kind of Indian continental perspective where we would say the 16th century basically is the history of the Mughals. It's the history of these kind of big entities. Who cares about these guys sitting out there on the coast? And then for the Portuguese, of course, the history is entirely centered around their activities with the fact that the Mughals exist somewhere on the periphery. I think the true measure of it is the qualitative interactions at the level of fairly mundane dealings of nameless people.
They ruled this territory, Goa, Daman and Diu, for almost about 451 years, which is a pretty long period. Even Kadambas, who ruled over Goa for about 400 years, could not compete with them.
We invited the Portuguese. We meaning the Saraswat Brahmins. And the calculation was, these guys will come, trade for some time, make their money and go. In the event, neither they make money nor go.
This relation between the East and the West that started here with the coming of the Portuguese, that has had a very overriding effect throughout India. Unless you have a very parochial or a very narrow down vision, you can always say that we were the gainers.
I could never say that any form of oppression is beneficial. Some benefits may result, but I will never sit and say, oh, well, it's a good thing, because we can never know what would have happened had the people not been colonized and oppressed.
Societies have changed or evolved much more through what they have acquired than what they have invented. It is a living process. And in fact, if something is solidified, it can only become fossilized.
The Portuguese left their ghosts, you see. It says wherever you go, you will find their ghost there, you see. So it is an imponderable, non-material legacy which is there, you see.
Au saiba poltori weta damula logna kueta mak saiba wati da koi mak saiba wati korona au saiba poltori weta damula matuantu weta mak saiba wati da koi mak saiba wati korona ge 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 ga saiba makanaka go ge 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 ga saiba makanaka go imuchi payat li paisana ge ga saiba Matanakago, shooting, booming, atoli, mate borun atoli, moja pocha pulem bostoli, hai bostoli, outside Bapotori weta, damula logna guveta, matsai bawati dakoi, matsai bawati korona. Kyrie eleison. Sogle muje vido cintunu dukangoroitau. Sonsran maka nare konu diun chaguzavonu. Undra moja mama aniau santantuka, undra moja mama aniau santantuka, ani masori chapila lagi feda mandinaka, ani masori chapila lagi feda mandinaka. Amani gumani nach papa, amani gumani nach papa, commando shiva shiva, commando shiva re, amani gumani nach papa, amani gumani nach papa. Commando Shiva Shiva, Commando Shiva re, Maya